Daniel Voss stood at the front of the ballroom with a microphone in his hand and 300 people watching him, and the first thing he did with that attention was turn it into a weapon against his own wife. "Everyone, I want you to meet the woman who has spent the last 15 years doing absolutely nothing with her life except spending my money," he said, laughing, gesturing toward the table where Renata Voss sat frozen, her hands folded in her lap, her face draining of color in front of their 12-year-old twins. A few guests laughed along with him, the nervous kind of laugh people give when they don't know whether something is a joke. Renata did not laugh. She looked at her son and daughter, who were staring down at their plates, and she understood in that moment that her husband had just done something he could never take back. What Daniel Voss did not know, what he had never bothered to ask in 15 years of marriage, was that the company whose success he was celebrating that night did not belong to him in the way he believed it did. And by the time he found that out, it would be far too late to fix what he had broken. Welcome to Hill Tales Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment below with your time and where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to become part of our growing family. 3 months earlier, nobody at Voss Logistics would have predicted any of this. Daniel Voss was, by every outward measure, a man who had built something real. At 47, he ran a freight and distribution company out of Charlotte, North Carolina, with 11 warehouses across the Southeast and contracts with 2 national retail chains. He drove a black Range Rover with a vanity plate that said Vosslog, wore tailored suits to meetings he didn't need to dress up for, and had developed over the past several years a habit of describing the company entirely in the first person. He built it. He grew it. He took the risk. He had not built it alone, and the risk had not been entirely his. But that was a detail Daniel had stopped mentioning so long ago that he had nearly convinced himself it had never been true. Renata Voss had been a different person once, or maybe she had always been this person, and marriage had simply taught her to take up less space. She had a finance degree from North Carolina State and had spent 4 years working as a controller for a regional trucking company before she met Daniel at a logistics conference in Atlanta. He was loud and confident and funny in the specific way that made people feel like being near him was an event. She was careful and precise and good with numbers in the specific way that made people assume she was quiet because she had nothing to say, rather than because she was always thinking 3 steps ahead. When Daniel decided to start his own company 18 years ago, he had $40,000 in savings and a business plan with several optimistic assumptions in it. Renata had $90,000 from a small inheritance, a far more conservative business plan, and the accounting background to actually run a company instead of just dreaming about one. They agreed, in a conversation at their kitchen table that neither of them wrote down at the time, that the company would be a 50-50 partnership. Daniel would handle sales, client relationships, and growth. Renata would handle finance, operations, and contracts. For the first several years, this arrangement worked exactly as intended, mostly because the company was small enough that everyone could see who was doing what. But companies grow the way families grow, slowly, then all at once, in ways that change the shape of every relationship inside them. By the time Voss Logistics had 40 employees, Daniel was the face people saw. He was the one shaking hands at industry dinners, the one quoted in the regional business journal, the one whose name appeared first when reporters asked who started the company. Renata was the one in the back office reconciling invoices, negotiating with the bank, and making sure the trucks had insurance. Nobody decided this was fair. It simply became the shape of things, the way water finds the lowest path without anyone choosing the route for it. There was a specific year, Renata could trace it precisely, though she rarely said so out loud, when the language around the company started to shift. It happened in small ways at first. A reporter asked Daniel about his journey building the business, and Daniel answered as though he had built it. A new employee referred to Renata as Daniel's wife who does the books, and nobody corrected the description, including Renata, who had learned that correcting people exhausted her more than it satisfied her. By the time the twins, Mia and Theo, were old enough to understand what their parents did for work, they understood it the way the rest of the world did. Dad ran the company. Mom helped out with the office stuff. This was not entirely Daniel's fault, and Renata never let herself believe it was. Some of it was her own choice. She had never wanted the spotlight, had never wanted her name on a building or her face in a magazine. She liked solving problems quietly and watching them stay solved. But there is a difference between choosing not to seek credit and having credit erased without your consent, and somewhere in those 18 years, the line between those two things had become impossible to see. What Daniel genuinely did not understand, what he had never once asked his wife directly, in any of those 18 years, was the actual legal structure underneath the company he believed he owned outright. The truth was simple, and it had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Renata's home office the entire time. Voss Logistics had been incorporated, at Renata's insistence and against Daniel's mild objection at the time, as two separate legal entities. The operating company, Voss Logistics LLC, handled day-to-day business, the trucks, the warehouses, the contracts, the employees. Daniel ran this entity and held 60% of it, a number Renata had agreed to because Daniel's sales relationships were genuinely the reason the company had early clients at all. But the operating company did not own its own warehouses, its own trucking fleet, or the commercial real estate the business depended on. That belonged to a separate holding entity, Hartwell Capital Partners, named after Renata's maiden name, which she had formed quietly in the company's third year, when a tax attorney friend had warned her that operating companies in the freight industry were exposed to enormous liability risk if a truck was ever involved in a serious accident. Keep the assets separate from the operations, the attorney had told her. If something goes wrong on the road, you don't want to lose the building too. Renata had taken that advice seriously. Daniel had signed the paperwork establishing Hartwell Capital without reading it closely, the way he signed most documents that didn't involve a check coming in or going out. Hartwell Capital owned the warehouses outright. It owned the trucking fleet, which it leased back to the operating company at market rates. And Renata Voss held 100% of Hartwell Capital, alone, structured that way specifically so that her family's core assets would be protected no matter what happened to the operating business. In practice, this meant something Daniel had never once considered in 18 years of building his image as the self-made man behind Voss Logistics. Every truck he drove past with the company logo on the side, every warehouse he walked through and called his own, every piece of physical infrastructure that made the business function, all of it belonged to his wife. He paid her company rent every month. He had been paying her rent every month for 15 years, routed through an accounts payable line item he had never personally reviewed, because reviewing it was Renata's job. For most of those years, none of this mattered, because the marriage worked well enough that ownership structure was an academic question nobody needed to raise. Renata was not interested in using her leverage as a weapon. She had built Hartwell Capital as a shield, not a sword, and she had genuinely believed, for a long time, that she would never need to think about it as anything else. What changed was not the business. What changed was Daniel. It started, as these things often do, with attention. Daniel had always enjoyed being noticed, but somewhere around his mid-40s, the enjoyment turned into something closer to dependence. He joined a regional business association that gave out an annual Entrepreneur of the Year award, and when he didn't win it the first year he applied, he spent 2 weeks in a foul mood that Renata recognized but couldn't quite name. He started working with a marketing consultant to build his personal brand, a phrase he used at the dinner table with a straight face while Mia rolled her eyes behind a textbook. He started posting on social media about leadership and grit and the loneliness of being the one who has to make the hard calls, language that made Renata wince slightly every time she saw it, because she could not remember the last hard call Daniel had actually made without her. The credit erosion, which had been a slow drift for most of the marriage, became something closer to active erasure. At a company holiday party 2 years before the ballroom incident, Daniel gave a speech thanking the team that helped him build something from nothing, and listed 6 employees by name. He did not mention Renata, who was standing at the back of the room near the coat check, holding a glass of wine she had stopped drinking from 20 minutes earlier. She did not say anything that night. She told herself it was an oversight, the kind of thing that happens when a man has had 2 drinks and is enjoying himself. She told herself the same thing the following year, when it happened again, this time at a smaller scale, a magazine profile in which Daniel was asked about his support system, and answered with a paragraph about his college mentor and a single sentence about his wife and kids at home, as though Renata's relationship to the business were entirely domestic. Mia found that magazine article first. She was 14 by then, sharp in the specific way that teenagers become sharp right before they stop being children, and she brought the article to her mother's office with a question that Renata had been avoiding asking herself for years. "Mom, why doesn't he ever say you started the company too?" Renata had not had a good answer. She had said something about how some people just aren't naturally good at sharing credit, and Mia had looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between disappointment and concern, the look of a child realizing her mother is choosing to accept less than she deserves. That conversation stayed with Renata in a way few others had. Not because Mia had said anything especially harsh, but because it was the first time someone in her own family had asked the question out loud, instead of simply absorbing the version of the story Daniel told. The twins were, in many ways, the part of the marriage that had remained genuinely good. Daniel was not a bad father. He showed up to Theo's baseball games. He helped Mia with her math homework when she'd let him. He was affectionate in the loud, physical way some fathers are, full of shoulder squeezes and forehead kisses, and, "That's my kid," announced to whoever happened to be standing nearby. Renata had never doubted that he loved their children. What she had started to doubt, slowly and then all at once, was whether he understood what he was teaching them by erasing her. Mia was starting to notice patterns Renata herself had spent years not naming. Theo, quieter and more conflict-averse than his sister, mostly noticed that dinner conversations got tense whenever the business came up, and had developed the habit of changing the subject before anyone could say something they'd regret. The marriage might have continued indefinitely in this slow, uneven equilibrium. Daniel taking credit, Renata absorbing it, the children growing more aware of the imbalance without anyone forcing a reckoning, if not for the award. The Carolinas Business Excellence Gala was, by regional standards, a significant event. 500 business leaders, several state legislators, a keynote speaker flown in from a national trade publication. Daniel had been nominated for the Visionary Leadership Award, a category that, despite its grand name, was essentially a popularity contest among the region's mid-sized company founders, decided by a panel that valued charisma and quotability roughly as much as actual business results. Daniel found out he had won 3 weeks before the gala, and from that moment forward, the household revolved around the event in a way that made Renata increasingly uneasy. He hired a speechwriter, a young man named Caleb who specialized in executive narrative, and spent 2 evenings a week working with him on what Daniel kept calling his origin story, a phrase that made Mia, listening from the next room, visibly cringe. Renata read an early draft of the speech the week before the gala, because Daniel had left it on the kitchen counter and she could not help herself. It was 4 pages long. It mentioned his father, who had worked in shipping his whole life and never made it past warehouse foreman. It mentioned the $40,000 Daniel had risked starting the company, a real number, the only number in the speech that was entirely accurate. It mentioned 12 years of sacrifice and sleepless nights. It did not mention Renata's name once, not even in the brief, "I want to thank" section near the end, which instead thanked his sales team, his operations manager, and, oddly, his golf coach. Renata sat at the kitchen table with that draft for a long time after she finished reading it. She did not cry, which surprised her a little. What she felt instead was a kind of clarity, the specific clarity that comes after years of telling yourself a story isn't really happening, finally admitting that it is. She thought about saying something to Daniel directly. She had, in fact, tried versions of that conversation before, gentle ones where she'd mentioned feeling overlooked and Daniel would apologize sincerely, mean it in the moment and then forget within a week because nothing in his daily life ever reminded him that anything needed to change. She thought about asking him to add a sentence to the speech. She decided, somewhere around 11 that night, that she was tired of asking. She did not confront him. She did not threaten him. She did, quietly over the following 2 weeks, make a series of decisions that she would later describe. When her daughter finally asked her about it, months afterward, not as revenge but as the natural result of being honest with herself for the first time in a long while. The first thing Renata did was call her tax attorney, the same one who had advised the Hartwell capital structure 15 years earlier, now well into his 60s and still sharp as anything. She asked him a simple question. If she chose to enforce the existing lease agreements between Hartwell Capital and Voss Logistics at strict market terms, rather than the informal, below-market arrangement that had existed for years out of spousal courtesy, was that within her legal rights as sole owner of the holding company? It was. It had always been. Nobody had ever exercised that right because nobody had ever needed to. The second thing she did was review, line by line, the operating agreement for Voss Logistics LLC, the document establishing Daniel's 60% and her 40% ownership of the company he ran day to day. She found, buried in a clause neither of them had thought about in a decade, that major related party transactions, including lease renewals with affiliated entities like Hartwell Capital, required approval from both members, not just the majority holder. Daniel had been treating the lease renewal as a formality for years, signing his own approval and having Renata countersign without discussion, because that was simply how it had always been done. The third thing she did, and the one that mattered most, was nothing at all. She did not change a single financial arrangement. She did not raise the rent. She did not refuse to sign the next renewal. She simply stopped being invisible in her own mind, and she waited to see what Daniel would do with the platform he was about to be given. She told herself, with the kind of honesty she rarely allowed herself, that if he stood up at that gala and thanked her, even briefly, even in a single sentence, she would let the whole question go. She did not need a public announcement of partnership. She needed evidence that her husband still saw her as one. The night of the gala arrived warm and overcast, the kind of late spring evening in Charlotte where the air feels thick before a storm that never quite breaks. Renata wore a navy dress she had bought for the occasion and barely felt like herself in. The twins came along, both of them in formal clothes that made them look strangely adult. Mia in heels she'd practiced walking in for a week. Theo in a tie he kept loosening the moment Daniel wasn't looking. The ballroom at the Excelsior Hotel held round tables draped in white linen, a stage at the front with a podium and a single spotlight, and the specific buzz of several hundred people who had all dressed up to be seen being successful together. Daniel was electric that night, moving between tables, shaking hands, laughing his big laugh, introducing Renata to people she'd met a dozen times before as though the introduction itself were a kindness he was doing her. Dinner came and went. The keynote speaker gave a forgettable talk about disruption. And then the MC, a local news anchor moonlighting as event host, called Daniel Voss to the stage to accept the Visionary Leadership Award. Daniel walked up with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted he belonged exactly where he was standing. He took the award, a glass plaque that caught the spotlight and threw small fractures of light across the ceiling, and he held it for a moment the way some people hold a microphone before they've decided what kind of person they're about to be in front of a crowd. He started well. He thanked the organization, thanked his employees by name, told a genuinely funny story about an early delivery disaster involving a flat tire and a Florida thunderstorm that had nearly cost the company its first major contract. The crowd laughed. Renata, watching from her table, allowed herself a small flicker of hope that maybe this would be the version of Daniel who remembered. And then he got to the part of the speech he'd practiced with Caleb, the part about sacrifice and risk and the loneliness of building something from nothing, and something in him, pride, momentum, the specific high of being applauded, pushed him past the edges of the script. You know, people ask me all the time how I did it, Daniel said, his voice carrying easily through the sound system, his eyes scanning the room with the particular hunger of a man who has decided the room belongs to him. And I tell them the truth. I did it because I refused to let anyone else carry the weight. I refused to make excuses. I refused to let anything slow me down. Not bad luck. Not bad partners, not even. He paused there, and Renata watched something shift behind his eyes. The dangerous shift of a man reaching for a laugh he hadn't planned to reach for. Not even a wife who, God love her, has spent the last 15 years asking me why I work so hard instead of asking what she could do to help, Daniel said, laughing at his own line before anyone else could decide whether to laugh with him. Everyone, please, Renata, stand up. Let everyone see the woman who has spent the last 15 years doing absolutely nothing with her life except spending my money. A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the room. The kind people give when a joke lands somewhere between funny and cruel and nobody wants to be the first to decide which. Renata did not stand up. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked first at Daniel, who was still grinning under the spotlight, clearly believing he had just delivered the most charming line of the night. Then she looked at the twins. Theo had gone pale and was staring at his plate, his jaw tight in the specific way he held it when he was trying not to cry in public. Mia was not looking down. Mia was staring directly at her father with an expression Renata had never seen on her daughter's face before. Not embarrassment, not hurt, but something closer to cold, clear-eyed contempt. The look of a child watching an adult fail a test she hadn't realized she was administering. Renata thought, in that moment, about every version of restraint she had practiced for 15 years. She thought about the magazine article, the holiday party speech, the 4-page draft on the kitchen counter that didn't mention her name. She thought about telling Mia that some people just aren't naturally good at sharing credit, and she thought about how thin and cowardly that explanation sounded now, replayed in her own head while her husband stood on a lit stage describing her as a woman who did nothing. She did not make a scene. She did not stand up and argue. She picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a precision that more than one person at the table would later describe as more unsettling than if she had shouted. "Renata!" Daniel said again into the microphone, his smile starting to falter slightly as the silence stretched a beat too long. "Don't be shy, come on." "I'm fine where I am, Daniel," Renata said, and though she did not have a microphone, her voice carried far enough across the suddenly quiet table that the people near them heard it clearly. "Finish your speech." It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But something about the calm in it cut through the room more effectively than shouting would have, and Daniel, sensing for the first time that he had misjudged something badly, gave a short, awkward laugh, thanked the crowd one more time, and left the stage to applause that felt thinner than the applause that had greeted him walking up. He did not understand, walking back to the table with his glass plaque in hand, that he had just made the most expensive joke of his life. The car ride home was silent in the specific way that feels louder than yelling. Mia sat in the back seat with her arms crossed, staring out the window. Theo had his earbuds in, though Renata suspected, watching him in the rearview mirror, that he wasn't actually playing anything. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, occasionally glancing at Renata, clearly waiting for her to either explode or pretend nothing had happened. The two responses he had learned to expect from her over the years. She did neither. She looked out the window at the dark highway and said nothing until they pulled into the driveway, at which point she turned to him and said, "We'll talk tomorrow. Not tonight, and not in front of them." Daniel, to his credit, looked uneasy for the first time that night. "Renata, come on, it was a joke, everyone." "Tomorrow," she said, and got out of the car. That night, after the twins had gone to bed, though Renata suspected, correctly, that neither of them was actually asleep, she sat alone in her home office with the lights off, looking at the filing cabinet where the Hartwell Capital documents had lived undisturbed for 15 years. She did not take anything out. She simply sat there for a long time, thinking not about revenge, which had never been the shape of her anger, but about a question that felt larger than the gala, larger than the speech, larger even than the marriage. What had she been protecting all these years by staying quiet? And was it actually still worth protecting? Mia knocked on the office door a little after midnight. Renata hadn't heard her come downstairs. "Mom! Hey, sweetheart! You should be asleep." Mia came in and sat on the small couch against the wall, the one Renata sometimes used when she worked late and didn't want to climb the stairs. For a moment she didn't say anything, and Renata didn't push her. "Is it true?" Mia finally asked. "What he said, that you don't do anything for the company?" Renata considered several answers. The soft one, the protective one, the one that would let Daniel off easy in his daughter's eyes the way she'd let him off easy for 15 years. She found, sitting in the dark with her daughter looking at her with that same clear-eyed expression from the ballroom, that she didn't have the energy for the soft answer anymore. "No," Renata said. "It's not true. I started that company with your father. I own the buildings the trucks park in. I own the trucks. Your father runs the day-to-day business, and he's good at that part. But the foundation underneath everything he does, that's mine. It has been since before you were born." Mia was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the particular seriousness of a 14-year-old encountering a piece of information that rearranges everything she thought she understood about her family. "Then why does he get to talk about you like that?" "Because I let him," Renata said, and saying it out loud, in her own voice, in her own dark office, felt like setting down something she had been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it had weight. "I'm not sure I'm going to keep letting him." Mia did not ask what that meant. She seemed to understand, in the way children sometimes understand things adults assume are too complicated for them, that her mother needed to figure that part out herself. The conversation Renata had with Daniel the next day did not go the way either of them expected. She waited until the twins had left for school, made coffee, and sat across from him at the kitchen table where, 18 years earlier, they had agreed on a 50-50 partnership neither of them had written down. Daniel had clearly spent the morning rehearsing an apology, and he delivered it earnestly enough. He was sorry, it was a bad joke, he didn't mean it the way it came out, he'd had a few drinks and gotten carried away with the speech. He loved her, she knew that, right? Renata let him finish. Then she asked him a question that had nothing to do with the gala at all. "Daniel, who owns the warehouses?" He blinked, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "What? The warehouses? The trucking fleet? Who owns them?" "Voss Logistics owns them. The company. We own them. He stopped, frowning, trying to remember the actual answer to a question he had genuinely never had reason to ask in 15 years. "What is this about?" "I want you to actually answer the question," Renata said. "Not what you assume. The actual legal answer. Go look at the lease agreements in the filing cabinet in my office. The ones you've signed every year for 15 years without reading them, and then come back and tell me what you find." Daniel's confusion shifted slowly into something more uneasy as he registered that his wife was not asking him a hypothetical question. He went into the office. Renata stayed at the kitchen table, drinking her coffee, and waited. He came back 20 minutes later holding the operating agreement and the Hartwell Capital formation documents. His face the color of someone who has just discovered a structural crack in a house he believed he owned outright. "This says Hartwell Capital owns everything," he said slowly. "The buildings, the fleet, all of it. And you own 100% of Hartwell." "Yes," Renata said. "I signed this." "You signed it 15 years ago when your attorney friend, well, my attorney technically, but you were there, told us to separate liability risk from the operating business. You didn't read it closely because you trusted me to handle it." Which I did. Which I have every year for 15 years. Daniel sat down slowly across from her, the documents still in his hands, and for the first time in longer than Renata could remember, he looked genuinely frightened of something she had said, rather than simply annoyed by it. So you're telling me, he said carefully, that you own the buildings, you own the trucks. I've been paying you rent. You've been paying the company rent. I am the company in the part that owns the assets. You run the operating business, the sales relationships, the contracts, the day-to-day decisions. That's real, Daniel. That's actually yours, and you're good at it. But the foundation under all of it has always been mine. I built that protection because I was scared of liability risk, not because I wanted leverage over you. I never once thought about using it. Not until last night. Daniel's hands had started to shake slightly, not from anger, Renata noted, but from something closer to the specific vertigo of a man realizing the ground beneath a 15-year story about himself was never as solid as he'd believed. Are you, Renata, are you threatening to take the buildings? Is that what this is? No, Renata said, and she meant it. I'm not threatening anything. I'm telling you the truth, because I'm done not telling you the truth. I'm done being a woman you described to 300 people as someone who does nothing. I built half of what you stood on that stage and accepted an award for, and I have spent 15 years letting you forget that because I told myself it didn't matter, because I told myself I didn't need the credit. And maybe I really didn't need the credit. But our daughter asked me last night if it was true that I don't do anything for this company. And I had to explain to a 14-year-old why her father doesn't know that already. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the coffee in both their cups had gone cold by the time either of them spoke again. What do you want? Daniel finally asked, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice had lost the defensive edge it had carried since he'd walked back from the office. Tell me what you actually want, because I don't know how to fix something I didn't know was broken. Renata had thought about this question a great deal in the hours since the gala, sitting alone in her dark office, and she found that her answer, when it came, surprised even her with how simple it was. I don't want the buildings, she said. I don't want to punish you, and I don't want to blow up our family in front of those kids, because I watched both of them sit at that table last night and absorb something they're going to carry for a long time, and I don't want to add to that. What I want is, for the next time you talk about this company, to a reporter, to a room full of people, to our children, you tell the truth. Not the whole complicated legal truth. Nobody needs a lecture on holding company structures. Just the actual truth. That you didn't do this alone. That I am not the woman standing in the background spending your money. That I am the reason this company has survived every downturn for 18 years. Because I'm the one who made sure it never carried more risk than it could absorb. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the documents on the table, and when he looked back up at her, something in his face had changed. Not entirely, not all at once, the way it never does in real marriages between real people, but enough that Renata could see the beginning of an actual reckoning rather than a performance of one. I don't know how I let myself believe I did this by myself, he said quietly. I think I liked being the guy people clapped for. And it got easier every year to believe the version where that guy did it alone, because that version made me feel like more. I know, Renata said. I watched it happen. I just didn't say anything for 15 years because I told myself I was being generous. I think mostly I was being scared. Scared of what it would mean to ask for something and have you say no. What followed over the next several weeks was not a single dramatic conversation that fixed everything, because real marriages are rarely fixed in a single conversation, no matter how honest. It was a slower, more uneven process. Daniel sitting with Renata to actually review the company's finances for the first time in years, asking questions instead of assuming. Daniel calling the regional business journal that had run the profile 2 years earlier and asking, somewhat awkwardly, whether they'd be interested in a follow-up piece that more accurately reflected the company's ownership structure. Daniel sitting Mia and Theo down at the kitchen table, without Renata prompting him, and telling them plainly that what he'd said at the gala wasn't true, and that he was sorry, and that their mother had built something just as real as anything he had built, even if she'd never once needed people to clap for it. Mia did not forgive him immediately, and Renata didn't push her to. Theo, who processed things more slowly and privately, came around first, in the quiet way he did most things. Leaving a card on his father's desk a few weeks later that simply said, "I'm glad you said sorry to Mom," which Daniel kept in his top drawer long after the rest of that spring had faded into memory. The company itself changed in small but permanent ways. Daniel insisted, against Renata's initial objection, that her name be added formally to the company's public materials, not as a courtesy title, but as co-founder, a word that had technically been true for 18 years and had simply never been written down anywhere a stranger might see it. The next industry profile that ran, 6 months later, was about both of them, and it included a line Renata read 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. Voss Logistics was built by Daniel and Renata Voss together, a partnership that has quietly underpinned every major decision the company has made since its founding. It was not a perfect resolution. Daniel did not become, overnight, a man entirely free of the need for applause, and Renata did not become, overnight, a woman entirely comfortable stepping into a spotlight she had spent 18 years avoiding. But something essential had shifted between them, something that showed up not in grand gestures but in small, repeated ones. Daniel checking with her before he made commitments that touched the business, Renata speaking up in meetings instead of writing notes for someone else to read, the two of them sitting together at industry events instead of Daniel working the room while Renata watched from a table near the back. A year after the gala, Voss Logistics was nominated again for an industry award, this one for sustained growth rather than individual leadership, a category that, by its design, required both their names on the application. Daniel asked Renata, with a kind of nervousness she hadn't seen in him in a long time, whether she'd be willing to come up on stage with him if they won. "I'm not big on speeches," she told him. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said. "I just don't want to stand up there without you again. Not after last time." They won. And when Daniel's name was called, he walked to the stage, took Renata's hand, and brought her up with him, and this time, when he spoke into the microphone, the first thing he said was her name. Mia, watching from the table with Theo beside her, didn't say anything out loud, but Renata, glancing back for just a moment before she stepped up beside her husband, saw her daughter's expression had changed from the cold, clear-eyed contempt of that night at the Excelsior Hotel into something quieter and warmer, something closer to relief. The particular relief of a child watching a parent finally become someone worth the loyalty she'd never stopped giving anyway. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship, a family, or a career where you gave more than you ever received credit for, and stayed quiet about it because speaking up felt harder than absorbing the silence? What would it have taken for you to finally say something? If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and consider subscribing to Hill Tales Stories so you never miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.